what I want to read now is that this is from the Catholic Encyclopedia on relics, and this is the point where they say, hey, a lot of other stuff it's hard for us to trace back that far, but this one we can trace all the way back to the scriptures. And there's two interesting points I want to make about the Roman Catholic Encyclopedia's entry on relics. First, it says, few points of faith can be more satisfactorily traced back to the earliest ages of Christianity than the veneration of relics. From the Catholic standpoint, there was no extravagance or abuse in this cult, as it was recommended and indeed taken for granted by writers like Augustine, Ambrose, Jerome, Gregory of Nyssa, Chrysostom, Gregory of Nazianzen, and by all the other great doctors without exception. So what I want to first point out is how interesting it is that they say, oh yes, this can be traced all the way back to the earliest days of Christianity, and here's all these people that endorse it. Well, every person that they listed is from the latter part of the 4th century. That's interesting. Now we'll get into some of the evidence that they provide, but there's another section in this entry on relics that I thought was very interesting, is that they say it's not easy to figure out when this started, but they give an example. And they say, neither is it quite easy to determine the period at which the practice of venerating minute fragments of bone or cloth, small parcels of dust, etc., first became common. We can only say that it was widespread early in the 4th century, and that dated inscriptions upon blocks of stone, which were probably altar slabs, afford evidence upon the point which is quite conclusive. Okay, so they're saying we can at least show that early in the 4th century this was widespread. But what's interesting is that the example they give as evidence that this was widespread in the early 4th century is from a slab of stone that's dated to 359 AD. That's the latter part of the 4th century. That's not early 4th century, that's the latter part of the 4th century. And what we'll find as we proceed through the means of veneration, that they don't even have evidence of the means of veneration, much less just the veneration itself. And by means of veneration, I mean the kissing and the kneeling and the bowing and the incense. And we'll get to that in just a second. But this is something that Roman Catholics think goes all the way back to the apostles and earlier. And they will rest on that and say, see, this is just evidence that you need to be Roman Catholic. And we're going to look at some people a little bit later in the podcast, look at the testimony of some people who converted to Roman Catholicism, in part because they finally accepted that, wow, relic veneration of the early church looks a lot like Roman Catholicism, so I guess I'll just have to become Roman Catholic. And this is, again, it's the purpose of our podcasts on these, to show that you don't have to take those arguments lying down. The best Roman Catholicism could do is the latter part of the 4th century, and we're going to prove that today on relics. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was very good. Just one quick clarification. When and this is just in case people are unfamiliar with Roman Catholicism, when you're talking about the saints, the Catholics have a different view of saints than the Protestants. The Protestants believe that every believer is ultimately a saint, but the Catholics would basically limit sainthood to somebody who is very special, who lived an exemplary life, and somehow through their life earned sainthood. So we're not just talking about anybody who died in the faith. We're talking about people who maybe did something that was exemplary during their lifehood, and
yes. That's correct. It's a different meaning of saint. We address each other as saints because the scriptures refer to living believers as saints, like the saints at Ephesus, for example. But in Roman Catholicism, the saint is someone who has departed, and then after examination is determined to have been exemplary, and therefore gets elevated to the status of sainthood, or is canonized as a saint, and that's something that's done by the Pope. So yes, right. That's when we're talking about that they're venerating the relic of a saint. They're talking about someone that has been declared to be a saint by Roman Catholicism.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, let's go.
Okay.